13 days until the election, C-SPAN is your primary source for campaign 2018. Next, a look at the race for Attorney General in Minnesota. Democratic Congressman Keith Ellison faced Republican challenger Doug Wardlow in a debate over the weekend. It went about an hour.
Okay, now let's begin this hour-long debate. Your moderators tonight, 5 Eyewitness News chief political reporter Tom Hauser and anchor Leah McLean.
And good evening, and thank you for joining us. We do appreciate that both of the major party candidates for Attorney General have agreed to join us tonight, and we look forward to hearing from both of you on important issues.
Yeah, we're going to cover a wide range of topics tonight. We want to start with opening statements tonight on why you are running for the office of Attorney General. Keith Ellison, let's start with you. 30 seconds, please.
Thank you. I'm running for Minnesota Attorney General because I want to help Minnesotans afford their lives and to benefit from human and civil rights that everybody should enjoy. You know, when you see insulin gallop in price over the course of just a few years, it's tough to afford your life if you have diabetes. If you see student loan debt going up, wages stagnating, you need somebody, an attorney general, who's going to be on your side to make sure that when the consumer frauds are happening, when your farm is in jeopardy, that the attorney general is standing with you.
And Mr. Wardlow, you have 30 seconds.
Well, thank you. You know, my wife Jenny and I, we live in Prior Lake, and we have 3 young children. I want them to grow up in a Minnesota where the streets are safe, the law is respected, and the weakest among us are protected. And that is the job of the Attorney General. That is why I'm running. You're going to see a clear contrast tonight between myself and Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison is a radical Washington politician who wants to push a radical policy agenda through the courts. That's where I'm different. That's not what you'll see from me. I'm going to be an independent voice, beholden to no political party. I'm going to enforce the law and protect and defend all Minnesotans.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wardlow and Mr. Ellison, for those opening remarks. Mr. Ellison, character has become a major issue in this campaign for Attorney General. Just before the primary election, you were accused by a former girlfriend of domestic abuse. She says she has a video of the incident. You have responded to this in the past, but this is the widest audience yet statewide that you have to respond to this. Can you tell us, again, in your own words, how you respond to these allegations?
Well, I consider these allegations very serious, which is why I fully cooperated with the investigation. And that investigation, which is a 15-page report, which anyone could read, has found that the allegations were unsubstantiated. I can tell you that I believe that it's wrong to politicize a tragic situation like this, and I think that it is absolutely improper for this to become a political football and a weapon in this particular election, particularly when many of the people who are weaponizing this allegation have failed to bring it up in other critical situations. For example, President Trump has been credibly accused 19 times, one on tape. In fact, no one can forget that particular occasion, yet the people who continue to weaponize this allegation against me have failed to mention that at all. And let me note as well that this is just a tactic to divert from the critical issues in this particular race. This race is about who's going to be the Attorney General, who's going to be best to represent Minnesotans. I'm that person.
To be clear, you deny it. You deny the allegations.
Without a doubt.
Mr. Wardlow, your opponent denies the allegation. Do you accept that denial, or is this a legitimate issue for voters to consider when they go to the polls on Election Day?
Well, this is absolutely a legitimate issue for the voters to consider. You know, President Trump is not on the ballot here. Keith Ellison is, and he wants to be our state's top cop, our top law enforcement official. There are serious and troubling allegations of domestic violence that have been leveled against Mr. Ellison by 2 different women. And those 2 different women have brought those allegations forward, and they're about conduct that's pretty recent in time, 2005 and 2016. There is overwhelming evidence to support these allegations. This is not a situation where it's just naked allegations. There is overwhelming evidence in the form of a 911 call report. There are witnesses. Karen Monahan actually spoke with a number of people shortly after the abuse occurred. And those are witnesses. There are medical records. There's a lot of evidence. So these are very troubling and very serious allegations that are corroborated. There's plenty of evidence for the public to conclude that Keith Ellison should not be the state's top law enforcement official.
Mr. Ellison, as a follow-up to this, again, Karen Monahan says she has video of this. You say the video does not exist. Can you assure voters that this video, will not surface before Election Day?
Absolutely. It can't possibly surface because the behavior described I didn't engage in. But let me just say that there are no 2 allegations. The one that Mr. Wardlow is referring to, I was the one that got the order for protection against that individual. I got the order for protection against them. And in this particular case, a month-long, 15-page, a month-long investigation by a trained professional expert in employment law looked at everything, and concluded that they could not sustain these allegations. They're unsubstantiated, and I can assure you that the behavior described, I never engaged in.
Mr. Wardlow, as you know, in Washington, D.C., there was recently confirmation hearings for now Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Some people have said there's a double standard, the way he was treated and the way Mr. Ellison is being treated. Can you address that, and do you believe that is true?
Yes, I do believe that is true. There is a double standard, and I think it reveals that a lot of party bosses on the Democratic side, they care about power and they care about politics. They're willing to smear Brett Kavanaugh with allegations, and they don't look at those allegations with the same standards. They look at Mr. Ellison, and Mr. Ellison is the deputy chair of the Democratic National Committee. There is no one more political, really, than Keith Ellison. And so because he's the deputy chair of the Democratic National Committee, and because he's a Democrat, it appears that he's getting a pass. And the sham investigation he's talking about was put on by his own party, a lawyer in a law firm that has donated a lot of money to the DFL.
Mr. Ellison, is there a double standard? There was an allegation against Justice Kavanaugh. He denied it. There was an allegation against you. You denied it. Yet many Democrats believed Brett Kavanaugh's accuser but do not believe yours. Is there a double standard?
No, they're completely different cases and should be evaluated on their own facts. And therefore, and Brett Kavanaugh is a U.S. Supreme Court justice today. I went through a month-long investigation. His was foreshortened less than a week. But now that we're on the topic of political behavior, actually it is Mr. Wardlow who was on tape saying that he would fire Democrats in a political purge. That's political.
I'd like to ask about that.
We're getting to that topic next.
Thank you for the segue. Mr. Wardlow, you have campaigned for months saying your opponent would politicize the office of Attorney General. You were recently heard on tape saying you would fire 42 Democratic attorneys right off the bat and get Republican attorneys in there. So how do you explain what you meant by that?
Well, I think it should come as a surprise to no one that when a new person goes into an office like this, we got to shake things up. We can't take the politics out of the office of Attorney General. It has been thoroughly politicized by Lori Swanson and by Mike Hatch before her. We can't take the politics out of the office unless we make some changes. And I will make some changes, but I'm not going to use party as a litmus test for appointees. Rather, I'm going to make sure that everyone in the office can put the rule of law above politics.
Mr. Ellison,
I just urge people to listen to the quote. You can literally listen to Mr. Wardlow's voice saying right off the bat he is going to fire 42 Democrats and replace them with Republicans. But that's not all. He also
that's not
said
exactly
he
accurate.
also
That's been taken out of context.
No,
the fact of the matter is,
let him finish.
He also said that he was going to implement Trump's agenda if he gets in. That's also something he said. He also said he's going to use the office to change the complexion of the state for Republicans. Time after time after time, he has been the one accusing me of what he's doing, which is politicizing the office. In my entire history as a member of Congress, I have never asked anyone what their political affiliation was. I have helped people of all parties, and I would be glad to hire any Republican or independent who's willing to throw down and fight hard every single day for Minnesotans. I believe it's absolutely inappropriate to use a political purge, to pledge a political purge, and then not even stand by what you said in this statewide audience. This has been the cornerstone of Mr. Wardlow's campaign, that he's apolitical, and yet he says he's going to do a political purge. Listen to it for yourself.
Would you like to
I never
respond?
said anything about doing a political purge. The fact of the matter is, in those same comments, I said I'm fighting for this office not for the Republican Party, but rather for the cause of the rule of law and the Constitution and for liberty. But, there's really no one more political than Keith Ellison. This is the deputy chair of the Democratic National Committee. And he still wants to maintain that office if he is elected Attorney General. Those two positions are entirely incompatible. He has pledged on numerous occasions to join with other Democrat Attorneys General around the country to sue the president. He wants to use this office to wage a political war, to push a radical political and a policy agenda, and that's completely inappropriate. We should not be abusing or misusing taxpayer resources or the powers of this office to push forward any kind of policy agenda. And I will not do that as Attorney General. I will simply defend and protect Minnesotans and enforce the law.
Mr. Ellison, you have said as an Attorney General should be able to advance a political or legislative agenda. Is that one of the roles of the office, do you think?
I do think that it is entirely appropriate for the Attorney General to come up with a legislative agenda and work with the state legislature and the governor to pass things that will benefit a higher quality of law and justice in the state of Minnesota. For example, I believe that all Minnesotans, no matter who they are or who they love, should be able to go into any institution they want and purchase goods and services. Right now, at this very moment, there is a group called the Alliance for Defending Freedom that is suing in St. Cloud so that some videographers who don't like gay people can lawfully discriminate against them. Thank God Judge Thunheim threw that out. I will be somebody who says, no, we're not going to have any sort of situation where people can't go into a store, can't take benefit of some businesses. I'm going to make sure everyone benefits from services. In fact, Doug Wardlow worked for that group, the Alliance to Defend Freedom. I will stand up for equal rights for all. That'll be part of what I'm standing for as my policy agenda, liberty and justice for all.
And Mr. Wardlow, should the Attorney General's office be able to advance a political or legislative agenda?
The Attorney General should only advance a legislative agenda with respect to the budget of the Attorney General, but with respect to law and to justice, so a limited category of things. So Keith Ellison wants to push a radical political agenda. And just let me address the Alliance Defending Freedom bit he talked about. I want, as Attorney General, I'm going to stand up for the rights of all Minnesotans, regardless of sex, race, sexual orientation, or gender. Absolutely, all Minnesotans. And I'm not going to be political. And the Alliance Defending Freedom, the work I did there was fighting for First Amendment rights. The First Amendment protects free speech and freedom of religion. These are not controversial things. Apparently, Keith Ellison doesn't believe in the First Amendment. He's actually said that he wants his party to come out against the Second Amendment and push to eliminate the Second Amendment from, look it up, it is true. He wants to eliminate the Second Amendment from the Constitution. How can a person that wants to strip citizens of fundamental constitutional rights be the state's top law enforcement official?
That is a significant suggestion or allegation he has made. We will give you 30 seconds to respond.
Yeah, let me just say that I am a gun owner. I own 2 shotguns and a deer rifle. I go hunting. I go pheasant hunting. I go turkey hunting. I believe in the Second Amendment. I just think that we ought to do something about all these guns which result in such massive loss of life all over our state. We need to have sensible gun safety laws. I have said that. I stand by that. But I will tell you this. When Mr. Wardlow says this thing about the First Amendment, what he's saying is that my religion should allow me to exclude gay people from buying the services of a particular company. And I think that's wrong. I want to know, do you think that's true? I mean, that's what the lawsuit's all about. That's what your law firm is saying.
That's not true.
He has now made a significant allegation against you. I'll give you 30 seconds to respond, then we'll move on to another topic.
Absolutely. So my work at Alliance Defending Freedom, I fought for free speech and free thought and free religion, standing up for the rights of all Americans. These are fundamental constitutional rights. Everything he's saying is simply untrue. But if you want to talk about extremism, if you want to talk about discrimination, Mr. Ellison here has been associated with Louis Farrakhan, a terrible anti-Semite, for quite a long time. And Mr. Farrakhan is someone who said just a few days ago he compared Jews to termites. That is just abhorrent and evil. And, you know, Mr. Ellison here has never denounced Louis Farrakhan.
We were going to get to that later, but I can't let it sit there and rest for several minutes without you answering it. So, Mr. Ellison, you have 30 seconds, and then we'll move on to another topic.
I absolutely unqualifiedly denounce and dismiss and avoid and reject the views of Louis Farrakhan. I've said that many years ago. Look, in the early 1990s, Louis Farrakhan was a person speaking to issues of African American civil rights. At that time, he had some things I thought he had to offer. He made it very clear in the early 90s that his views and mine were absolutely incompatible, and I've been saying that ever since, and my opponents keep on dragging it up, but
actually,
it isn't
I just
true.
need to respond to that because the Washington Post, for trying to dissociate yourself from Mr. Farrakhan,
we have more than another half hour to go.
Said that you gave you a award of 4 Pinocchios. And, you know, in 1995, you penned an op-ed in Insight News.
Mr. Wardlow,
95 was a long time ago.
You called him a role model for youth.
My views have changed dramatically since then.
Mr.
And I
Ellison,
reject those
Mr.
views.
Wardlow,
but will you denounce the Alliance for Defending Freedom?
Oh, no, because they fight for First Amendment freedoms.
Mr. Wardlow, we will continue with this line of questioning in a moment. Let's move on to another topic right now, and then we'll come back to some of these issues. Mr. Ellison, how active should the state be in challenging federal laws that you don't agree with as Attorney General? Well, and give us some examples.
Well, let me just start out with this lawsuit that some attorneys general have filed to strip out pre-existing condition protections from the Affordable Care Act. That is a lawsuit that I'm very glad Lori Swanson has joined. I think that when I talk to Minnesotans about diabetes, about heart disease, about all the illnesses that people are plagued with, it terrifies them that the federal government is refusing to defend the law that these attorneys general are pushing. I will stand with people who have pre-existing conditions, fight for their ability to get health care access, and be there for them. I don't agree that the federal government is trying to put in a question around citizenship. The Constitution says count all persons. I don't agree with that policy. I don't agree that with the federal government's decision on the internet. I believe in net neutrality, and I think that there are some challenges that are certainly warranted there. And let's not forget about pulling children away from parents that the Trump administration is doing.
Mr. Wardlow, are there times that you would join other states in challenging the federal government?
Now, those times would be few and far between, but you just all heard Mr. Ellison say that he wants to basically challenge in court anything he disagrees with. And it wasn't too many days ago that Mr. Ellison said, and this is on tape, you can look it up on the internet, he said that he might not defend laws of the state of Minnesota that he doesn't agree with or that he thinks are not workable, is the word that he used. Well, that's unconscionable. The Attorney General is supposed to enforce the laws of the state of Minnesota. And it doesn't matter what you think about those laws. If they're constitutional, they must be enforced and they must be defended. That's what I will do as Attorney General. I will stand up for the laws of Minnesota and the people of Minnesota and simply defend and protect Minnesotans.
Do you have a response?
My response is that as a legislator of 12 years, congressperson and a legislator of 4, I will work with members of the legislature to make sure that not only are the laws constitutional, I'll insist upon that, but that we'll work together to make sure that if they pass a law, that it's something that can actually be implemented. That's the only point that I was making.
But you just said you were going to sue the federal government to challenge laws.
This goes back to this idea that this campaign where there's all this mudslinging and distortion all the time. I'm telling you what Doug Wardlow has said. He's trying to always distort, give half-truths about what I've said. I will stand up for the Constitution, and I will stand up for Minnesota law, and I will work with legislators to make sure that the laws make sense and can be effectively implemented.
Mr. Wardlow, final comment.
Well, you also said that you wouldn't defend necessarily laws you don't agree with or that you regard as not workable. You also said you're going to try to bypass Congress and sue the president and sue the federal government whenever you don't agree with a certain kind of a certain policy. And that's unconscionable. The Attorney General is supposed to protect the law. But you said that things that you disagree with, like net neutrality and things like that, you went through a list of policies there. So it's clear that you want to push a radical agenda, a policy agenda, through the courts using taxpayer resources and the Office of the Attorney General. That is completely inappropriate.
May I simply say, Tom, that if he believes that standing up for net neutrality is radical, then we don't agree. And we just don't agree on that. I'm going to stand for openness and access of information.
I think that I agree with that too, but the fact of the matter is that's a legislative decision for Congress, and it's not something that the Attorney General of Minnesota should waste or abuse taxpayer resources suing the federal government about.
We don't agree on that.
Let's move on to the next topic, gentlemen. Consumer protection. Mr. Wardlow, consumer protection has been a major function of the Attorney General's office in recent years. So if you were Attorney General, would that remain a top priority in the office?
Absolutely it would. Consumers need to be protected, and we need to protect especially our senior citizens from scammers and thieves and liars. That will remain a top priority of the office when I'm Attorney General. And we need to do that because that's one of the jobs of the Attorney General. It's in statute. Now, Keith Ellison, we can't trust Keith Ellison to protect consumers or anyone else. Just look at his atrocious record. Keith Ellison has regularly stood up for, rallied, and raised money for people who have murdered police officers. He's a cheerleader for cop killers. Assata Shakur, Sarah Jane Olson. Look these things up. They are absolutely true. You have rallied and raised money for domestic terrorists, Sarah Jane Olson.
Let's stay to
these are terrible things.
Protection.
So you can't trust Keith Ellison to protect consumers or anyone else. As Attorney General, I will absolutely enforce consumer fraud laws. I'm going to defend and protect all Minnesotans.
Mr. Ellison.
I just want to make it clear. I'm talking about Minnesota families, and he's talking about me. My point is that I'm here, my whole life is based on standing up for consumers and helping people afford their lives. You know, I'm so proud that Lori Swanson file suit to make sure that those price gougers with regard to insulin are being held accountable.
I agree with that.
She stood up, and she's making sure that people can afford their insulin. I think that's a good thing. She stood up for the people of Cottage Grove to make sure that they had clean water coming out of their tap, and held a great Minnesota company, but one that needed to be held accountable when it came to the toxins that they're being spewed into the neighbors in that particular community. She's been a good consumer advocate. I have stood up and helped pass the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's my consumer record of standing up for consumers, financial services, and student loan debt. This is why I'm running. That's my purpose, because I want to stand with consumers and help people fare well in this economy.
The criminal division has not been as much of a focus lately in this Attorney General's office. Mr. Wardlow, you've spoken about rebuilding the criminal division. So what would that look like under your leadership?
Well, we absolutely need to rebuild the criminal law division. You know, prior to Mike Hatch, there was a pretty robust criminal law division, and our county attorneys, especially in greater Minnesota, they don't really have the resources that they need at all times to handle difficult prosecutions when they arise. We need to make sure the Attorney General's office comes in and provides that support to keep Minnesotans fair and safe. We also need to provide statewide leadership on things like human trafficking. You know, hundreds of kids on a regular basis every single month in Minnesota are being sold for human trafficking purposes. As Attorney General, I will end that. I will put together a plan working with county attorneys and with law enforcement to put an end to human trafficking once and for all. And I'm going to fight the opioid epidemic as well. I'm not afraid to take on big pharma, but also we need to fight opioid pushers, and we need to stop opioids from coming across the border from Mexico and overseas from China, and that means cooperating with federal immigration authorities and on border enforcement as well. So I will absolutely rebuild the criminal law division and keep Minnesota fair and safe. We can't trust Keith Ellison to do that because he's a cheerleader for criminals. He stands with cop killers.
Absolutely.
And by the way, when he was in the state house in Congress, I'm not repeating myself. When you were in Congress, you opposed. Just let me finish. You opposed a bill to prevent sexual predators from teaching in schools. And that, just let that sink in.
Let's give Mr. Ellison a chance to respond to this question about divisions within the Attorney General's office that may need a little more attention or a little more focus.
As well as the allegations he just made.
Respond.
This may be one thing that Mr. Wardlow and I agree on, that the criminal division does need to be strengthened. I think that it is critically important for every county attorney in the state of Minnesota to know that there's no county too far away from the metro or too small to get the benefit and the help of the Minnesota Attorney General's office, as Keith Ellison's the Attorney General. I will boost up and help with criminal appeals. Many of them struggle to get that work done. When there's a big crime committed in greater Minnesota, you know, there are some counties that only have one or two county attorneys. We will be there to help them, because I want every county attorney who is the front line in defending Minnesotans, protecting them from crime, to know that the Attorney General's office will have their back every time. I make that pledge, and I am looking forward to fulfilling that role. We'll coalesce around issues like fentanyl and opioids, and we'll also be right there, particularly in our tribal communities, fighting to stop sex trafficking and human trafficking, labor trafficking, violations of prevailing wage laws.
All right, let's move on to another topic, immigration. Not much controversy here, so let's get right into it. Mr. Ellison, what role should state law enforcement play in immigration? For instance, should Minnesota provide sanctuary for illegal immigrants, at least in terms of not using state or local officials to enforce federal immigration law?
Yeah, I do not think that the law enforcement resources of our state should be used to enforce federal immigration law. I do believe that where cooperation is warranted, it should occur, but I just don't want our police officers asking people for their papers on the streets of our state. I think that it's best to do it in the way that the federal government does its role, the state government does its role. Now, let me just say there are certain areas where I believe the state has a role to play. You know, I have a particular friend who who has leukemia. His bone marrow match was his sister, who was in Tehran. Because of the Trump travel ban / Muslim ban, we had a lot of trouble getting that bone marrow match to the United States. And I think that there's a role for the state to play to make sure that Minnesotans in Minnesota, where they need to take advantage of the immigration law, can get those things done, particularly in situations like this.
Mr. Wardlow, as Attorney General, would you support using state and local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration law?
Well, I think our state and local law enforcement needs to cooperate with federal law enforcement. Federal law enforcement, these are our neighbors. They live with us here in Minnesota. It's not like some outside force coming in, right? So we need to cooperate with them. This is a nation of laws, but our immigration system is broken. We have some cities where the law is respected. We have some cities where it is not. We can't have cities flouting federal law. You know, that's making Minnesota a place that is less safe, and this is a big problem. Keith Ellison stands for open borders. He has gone around and campaigned for sanctuary cities. He basically wants to make Minnesota a sanctuary state, and that means that illegal immigrants who are dangerous criminals would not necessarily be reported to the federal government. That is terrible, and we cannot have a top law enforcement official who wants cities to flout federal law, who wants the state to flout federal law, and who is okay with having a sanctuary state and doesn't really believe in borders at all.
Mr. Ellison, your response.
Again, this is ridiculous. Of course, I believe in borders. The fact is that I believe that our ICE and the Border Patrol, they perform a function that is important, but I believe they need reform. We cannot have a situation where children and parents are being pulled apart at the border, and they don't even know how to put the families back together again. I mean, that's not a good thing. I hope you don't approve of that. I also think that it's important to understand that, look, we are a country where immigration literally helps drive economic and social benefit. We cannot keep pushing this harmful rhetoric that scares new Americans off. And I think that it's important to understand that if anybody commits a crime, they're going to be held accountable. If they don't have legal authorization, they're going to have to deal with the immigration law. That's just what the law is. But this scary stuff about I don't believe in borders and stuff, this is a myth. It's not true. And I hope that people pay attention to this overblown rhetoric.
Mr. Wardlow, final word.
Well, Mr. Ellison said recently that he thinks that borders create an injustice in general. And Mr. Ellison has been seen wearing a T-shirt that says, "I don't believe in borders."
That's a fashion
and
choice.
the fact of the matter is, well, it's an interesting fashion choice, isn't it? He voted present in Congress on abolishing ICE. So apparently he doesn't really respect our federal immigration authorities.
That's ridiculous.
We need to, well, these are the facts.
No,
they're stating facts. They are facts.
They are not
You can
facts.
look them up. And I encourage the voters of Minnesota to do that, to look up these facts, to see that Keith Ellison can't be trusted as our Attorney General. He stands for open borders, and that will make Minnesota less safe.
All right, let's move on to another topic. Mr. Wardlow, if elected as Attorney General, you'd likely be asked to weigh in on the issue of legalizing recreational marijuana. Would you support legalization?
Well, I think it's a legislative question, first of all. And I think the legislature, when they take a look at that question, they should consider all angles, but they need to look at what's going on in Washington State, and they need to look at Colorado, and they need to see. They should let that enter into their judgments of what's going on there and learn some lessons. But I think that that's a legislative question. The Attorney General's job is to enforce the law, not to pass laws, not to push policies. Keith Ellison wants to use the Attorney General's office to push a policy agenda. He said it many times just this evening. All the different policies that he agrees with or disagrees with, he wants to use the courts and the Attorney General's office to push those policies and bypass the representatives of the people. That's completely inappropriate.
If the state legislature were to say that they were supporting legalizing recreational marijuana, would you then support it?
If the legislature passes a law legalizing it, then absolutely I will defend that law, even if whether I disagree with it or agree with it, it doesn't matter. If it's constitutional, and it would be, then I will defend that law, and I will defend all of the laws of the state of Minnesota. Mr.
Ellison, do you support the legalization of recreational marijuana?
Yes. I think that it should be done carefully. It should be done thoughtfully. Obviously, we should benefit from all the experiences that other states and countries have had. We should keep the monopolies out, and I think that's very important. I don't want to see some large marijuana monopoly coming and dominating markets in Minnesota, but I think that it is. I also think we should look at people who've been convicted for marijuana offenses and see whether or not these people should get expungements of their records. But I do think that it's the right policy. Noah Johnson, by the way, who was also in this campaign, he has endorsed my campaign because he and I agree that we need to look forward on this policy deliberately, thoughtfully, learning from all experience. But I think it's an issue that's time has come, particularly for people who use it for medicinal purposes.
Thank you.
Mr. Wardlow, are you concerned, though, about if you legalize recreational marijuana? It wasn't that long ago legalizing medicinal marijuana was very controversial, and law enforcement had issues with that. What are you hearing from law enforcement on this issue?
Well, they are concerned about this issue, and I do have concerns about this issue, but that is up for the legislature to decide. I would just simply note that the Minneapolis Police Union has endorsed my candidacy, and they did that because they understand that I will have their back. And in fact, if law enforcement is watching tonight, that's my message to you. As Attorney General, I will have your back. We need to have law enforcement that is respected, and we need to make sure that they have all the resources they need to do their job.
But on the issue of recreational marijuana, have you heard from them specifically on that? If you were elected Attorney General, you would be the chief law enforcement officer in the state. It's likely the legislature will ask for your advice on this. What advice would you give them?
I have heard from law enforcement on that, and I would consult with law enforcement, and it would be good for law enforcement to go and testify at the legislature and to make their views known.
Would
Absolutely.
you be for or against legalizing recreational marijuana?
I don't think it would be appropriate for the Attorney General to take a position on a pure policy issue like that. I think the Attorney General should enforce the law and defend and protect Minnesotans. That is the job. The job of the Attorney General is not to weigh in and make laws, but Keith Ellison apparently thinks it is. But if he wanted to make laws, he should have stayed in Congress.
You get the final word on this.
Look, it is just absurd to say that a statewide office holder in a position like Attorney General should not have any political views or any policy views. Of course we do. And every Minnesota Attorney General that we've ever had was unafraid to say, yes, I think this is a good policy, but it's the legislature's job to pass it. I think this is a good policy, but they need to do this to make it constitutional. This idea that Mr. Wardlow doesn't have any views on anything is simply not the case. He has been very clear he's not for a woman's right to choose. He's been very clear he wants to use the office to suppress voting. He's been very clear he wants to put only Republicans in the attorney to fire Democrats and put Republicans in. It is very clear he has a policy agenda. He just doesn't want to say what it is. And I think it's fair for the people to know.
He's made a couple of accusations there. I'll let you respond.
I can just simply say this. The Attorney General is supposed to enforce the law, and as Attorney General, that is what I will do. I think it's completely inappropriate for Mr. Ellison here to suggest that the Attorney General should be some kind of bully for the legislature and try to push certain policy agendas. He wants to push a radical policy agenda. He's got a lot of different ideas, and of course I have opinions too, but that's the difference between myself and Mr. Ellison. He wants to use the Office of the Attorney General, which is a law enforcement office, to push certain policy positions. I want to enforce the law and simply defend and protect all Minnesotans.
Now, speaking of policy positions, gun laws, something, again, that the Attorney General may be asked to address in this next legislative session. Mr. Ellison, there's likely to be more action on this. What changes in state law might you advocate in terms of gun laws as Attorney General? You know, I would suggest to legislators that we need mandatory locks on firearms in homes. I think that there's no good reason to have high capacity clips in the household. But when I go hunting for turkey, I basically take 2 shells with me, and I don't think you need a whole lot more than that to defend your home. I think that we need to get together with groups that have dealt with the tragedy of mass shooting and one-on-one shooting and get their advice on these things. Studying the effects of gun violence, I think, is absolutely critical. I think that these weapons of war that like bump stocks and things like this just really have no place. So I'll just wrap up by saying I have seen firsthand the horrors of irresponsible gun laws. I'll never forget a friend of mine named Ruben Rahamim, who was killed right down the street from my office, and I stand up here for him and his family to say we're going to have sane gun laws. Mr. Wardlow, does Minnesota need stricter gun laws?
Well, I don't think Minnesota needs stricter gun laws. I think that the laws that we have are sufficient. But again, this is a legislative question. I think the legislature should address it, and they should hear from law enforcement. They should hear from all stakeholders and interested parties and the public when making their decision. Again, Keith Ellison is pushing forward policy positions, and he wants to do that with the Office of the Attorney General. And again, Mr. Ellison has said publicly on television that he wishes his party would come out against the Second Amendment.
Not true.
You cannot be against the Second Amendment and be the state's top law enforcement official. You want to strip people of their fundamental constitutional rights. That's wholly inappropriate.
I'm a gun owner, Tom. I own guns. I'm not against people owning guns. I own them myself, and I use them when I go hunting. But the point is, People are being killed in mass shootings every day. The point is people are being shot down one by one every day. There was a grandmother named Burdell Beeks who some young people who were very misguided, engaged in criminal behavior, shooting at each other, missed each other and killed her. This is a grandmother. We cannot stand by while this carnage on our street grows and act like there's nothing anybody can do about it. There are things we can do about it, and I'm going to be there to work with legislators, citizens, yes, police, and county attorneys to fashion laws that protect people.
On one specific issue, would you ever favor universal background checks?
Yes. Yes, I would. But the fact of the matter is that it, again, is a legislative question. What we need to do to protect Minnesotans and keep Minnesotans fair, keep Minnesotans safe, is we need to rebuild the criminal law division. We need to make sure that law enforcement has training and that law enforcement has resources in coordination with county attorneys. We need to back up our county attorneys and make sure that they have all the resources that they need to do their job. That's what the Attorney General should be focused on doing. That is what I will do as Attorney General. I will not be pushing a policy agenda and trying to change the law according to what I think the law should be. Rather, I'm going to respect the law, enforce the law, and then work with law enforcement and our prosecutors, our frontline prosecutors, our county attorneys to make sure that criminals are put behind bars. We can't trust Mr. Ellison to do that because Mr. Ellison has a history of cheerleading for cop killers and standing with criminals.
Untrue. You keep saying
you can look it up.
It doesn't matter how many times you say it, it's not true.
Just look it up, it's true.
So, Tom, here's the thing. It is, I think, ridiculous to assume that the Attorney General will not be consulted on how we protect Minnesotans from gun violence. The Attorney General will be consulted, and I will offer my views, including universal background checks, to make sure that Minnesotans are safe. Of course, we're going to respect the private right to bear and own arms, but we're also going to make sure that people are safe and protected. That's not happening now, but it will when I'm the Attorney General.
Let's talk about another area where the Attorney General is consulted. Mr. Wardlow, the Attorney General has to represent the governor in court often. How will you work to have a productive relationship with the governor, who may perhaps be of a different party?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's important for the Attorney General's office to work directly with state agencies and try to represent them in all cases when they're enforcing their rules. That's very important. Too often state agencies go out and hire their own attorneys. But, as an attorney, it's also important to counsel the client, which is the state agency, when they're going to do something that's illegal or beyond their statutory authority, and try to make sure they stay within their limits of their authority. That's important because we need to lift the burden of illegal regulations and unconstitutional regulations off of job creators. I would do that. Now, Keith Ellison here, he stands against Minnesota's economy every time it matters. He opposes mining. He would side with radical environmentalists who want to stop mining in northern Minnesota.
Untrue.
If they had the chance. That's absolutely true. He opposes pipelines in Minnesota that would create thousands of jobs. These are true things. These are facts. You can look them up. And the fact of the matter is, it's just part of the fact that Keith Ellison wants to push a policy agenda, and that policy agenda would be bad for Minnesota, and it's inappropriate to do that through the courts. That's what representatives of the people are for.
Mr. Ellison, back to the issue of working with a governor, potentially with a Republican governor. What would you do to foster a good relationship?
Well, I have to confess that I really look forward to Tim Walz being the governor of the state of Minnesota. I doubt that that's not going to be the case. I'm looking forward to that. But if he isn't, I know Jeff Johnson, and I'll work cooperatively with him. And I believe it is important to have an ongoing working relationship with everybody in state government and even at the U.S. Attorney's Office. We've got to be a team. I'll actually offer leadership to convene people around the critical issues that we're facing. Whether it's fentanyl, opioids, or no matter what it is, we will work together for the benefit of the people of the state of Minnesota. We will disagree, but we'll disagree above board. We won't say we don't have any views when we have them. We'll talk in a very concrete way, but we will look for ways to get to yes for the benefit of the people of the state.
And as far as representing the governor in a court case that may come up, you'd be comfortable representing the governor?
Again, if it's constitutional, if it's workable, then we'll get together and we'll figure out how to do that. And I don't mind talking about what I mean by workable. I mean, people pass laws all the time that are simply difficult to implement given the legal structure that we have. They may conflict with other law. They might be some ways that it just doesn't work that way. So I will work with the governor to make sure that the laws of the state are properly implemented, as long as they're constitutional, as long as they're not too vague or too or too irrational to implement properly.
Okay, so apparently Mr. Ellison just told us that if he thinks the law is irrational, he won't defend it, and he's not going to work with the governor to enforce the law. That's really remarkable. When I'm Attorney General, regardless of who the governor is, I think Jeff Johnson is going to win. He's a great guy, and it's looking very good, and I'm looking forward to working with Governor Johnson. But I can work with Tim Walz, I can work with any governor, because the job of the Attorney General is to provide legal advice to the governor and provide legal advice to state agencies and to defend and enforce the law, not to determine whether something's irrational and then try to change the law or try to challenge it or whatever we're talking about here.
I'm quite sure that a
is
graduate of Georgetown law knows what the rational basis test
well,
is.
that's right. That's right. Well,
so
yes,
that's
so
what I'm talking about. You know that. And so this is just another example.
So basically he wants to pick and choose the laws he wants to enforce. He's actually said that with respect to laws that might restrict abortion, that he would not defend them.
I think that if they don't comport with Roe, they're unconstitutional, and you better believe I'm not going to defend them.
So he's not going to defend laws that he doesn't agree with.
I believe in Roe v. Wade. I believe in a woman's right to choose. I believe in reproductive choice. And yes, I will defend that. I think that is a law, that is a constitutional fundamental right found in the Minnesota Constitution. And let's just be honest, Mr. Wardlow, you don't agree with that. And you plan on not on attacking that particular constitutional guarantee.
No, I don't. I'm going to uphold the law,
We'll
and
see.
I'm going to stand by the Constitution.
Based on your history,
I'm going to stand by the
doubt that.
Constitution and enforce the law like I've done for years as an attorney in private practice, representing clients I don't necessarily agree with.
Well,
and
let's
that's
talk
what a
about
lawyer
that.
does, zealously advocating for the rights of my clients. In this case, it will be the state of Minnesota and the people of Minnesota. And we're going to strictly enforce the law, and we're going to make sure that we protect and defend all Minnesotans fairly, and we're going to enforce the law evenly.
There's a Michigan case where there was a person who was working at a mortuary, I believe. They announced to their employer they were transgender, and the Alliance for Defending Freedom, represented by Mr. Wardlow, fired this man and upheld his discharge simply because he made this choice about his life. I mean, that's not just defending a client you don't agree with. Do you agree that gay people have equal rights in America?
Of course they do.
And in
and
Minnesota.
Of course I agree with that. Of course I agree with that.
What
And
about this
just
case? Let me ask you this.
No,
Let me
I'm
just
not
ask you
going
this.
to.
One at a time.
Well, let me
The
just
fact
ask
of the
you
matter
this.
is, can I respond? Because I need to
Let us
respond
ask
to
the
these.
question. Then you can respond.
What about this case in St. Cloud, where the videographers are seeking the right to discriminate against gay people based on their religious values? Do you agree with that, or do you not?
I don't know the details of that case, but the fact of the matter is this. I don't believe they're trying to discriminate, and I will defend and protect all Minnesotans and fight for the legal rights of all Minnesotans, regardless of sex, sexual orientation, or gender or race. That is absolutely the law of the state of Minnesota, that everyone has equal rights under the law, and I'm going to protect equal rights for every single Minnesotan. That's the job of the Attorney General.
Mr. Hauser, right now, you have the state of Minnesota on one side and the Alliance for Defending Freedom on the other side. The Alliance for Defending Freedom says that an owner of a business can tell people, we don't serve people like you here because they're gay, and it is the state of Minnesota that says we don't believe in that. It is Judge Thunheim said this reminds him of whites only stuff. My point is, where do you stand on this question?
That's absolutely preposterous.
Where do you stand?
With the people of Minnesota, and
Gentlemen, our next topic dovetails with this. The topic is extremism. Each of you has accused the other of being an extremist, one an extreme on the extreme right wing, one on the extreme left wing. Mr. Ellison, I'll start with you. You have said your opponent is a far-right conservative who is out of step with most Minnesotans. Can you give us some examples? I think you just have given us a couple. Give us a couple more. We'll give Mr. Wardlow a chance to respond.
Well, we could start out with him saying he's going to fire 42 attorneys based on them being Democrats, not liking their party. That's pretty extreme. You can move on for him saying he doesn't believe people have the innate right to vote. That's sort of extreme. You can move on to the fact that the Alliance for Defending Freedom, which he worked for and just took off his LinkedIn page a few days ago, has been listed by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. A hate group. That's a fact, and I think that's kind of extreme. He has made it clear that he's 100%, he said, pro-life, and he's going to use the Attorney General's office to push that. That's kind of extreme. I think that he said that he wanted to change the complexion of the state to elect more Republicans. I think that's on the extreme side. And he has said he has not said he's step up and defend pre-existing conditions protections for Minnesotans, which I also think is extreme. So,
And Mr. Wardlow will give you a chance to respond and also to mention some areas where maybe you think Mr. Ellison is to the extreme left. But first, in terms of what he just said about you.
Absolutely. Those things that he said are simply not true. With respect to pre-existing conditions, just let me be very clear on this. I stand for and support mandating pre-existing condition coverage. End of story. Period. That's it. And the fact of the matter is, Keith Ellison broke our healthcare system. Keith Ellison is one who voted for Obamacare, and because of that, we have skyrocketing premiums and skyrocketing deductibles. We nearly had a collapse of access to healthcare in rural Minnesota. And now what Keith Ellison wants is more government-run healthcare. You know, as P.J. O'Rourke said, if you think healthcare is expensive now, just wait till it's free. The fact of the matter is, Keith Ellison has a radical policy agenda he wants to push. With respect to all the other stuff he said, he had quite a list there. Those things are simply not true. With respect to Alliance Defending Freedom and the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center is a group that defames groups it disagrees with to raise money. That's all they really do. And you know, if as long as you're talking about extremism, Keith Ellison is the one who has been associated closely with Louis Farrakhan, who the Washington Post gave 4 Pinocchios to you for trying to deny your associations with Louis Farrakhan. In that 1995 op-ed in Insight News, you wrote that Louis Farrakhan is a role model for youth. This is the same person who just a few days ago compared Jews to termites.
Which
this is
I
unconscionable.
Condemn.
That's good. I'm glad you finally condemned that.
It's not
the fact of the matter
it's
is
long
this.
Ago.
Why didn't you condemn it as soon as Alan Dershowitz called on you to condemn it
look,
just the other day?
I've condemned
you were
those
silent.
words like
the
that.
The fact of the matter is this. I let you talk, now let me.
Okay, you go ahead. You're right.
You know, there are many other ways that Keith Ellison is extreme, and that is the question here. You know, he did oppose a bill in Congress to prevent violent sexual predators from working as teachers in our schools. And when he was in the State House, he opposed a bill that would have provided life sentences for violent sex offenders. He said that we don't necessarily need to be tough on crime when he opposed that bill in the Minnesota State House. That's terrible. Just let that sink in. He has supported and rallied and raised money for cop killers, including the murders of Sharif Willis, including Asada Shakur,
Untrue.
including Sarah Jane Olson. Just look these facts up. They're absolutely true. He gave a speech at a fundraiser in 2000 for Sarah Jane Olson, and at that same fundraiser, and Sarah Jane Olson, of course, is the person who tried to kill police officers, Kathleen Celaya, a.k.a., who tried to kill police officers in Los Angeles with pipe bombs.
Let's give Mr. Ellison a chance to respond. It's quite a laundry list there. I hope you were keeping track. Please respond.
Well, first of all, let me say that I believe that everybody gets the presumption of innocence. If there's somebody accused of something, before they are convicted, they have the presumption of innocence. I will not apologize for believing that. I believe police get the presumption of innocence. I believe that everyone gets it, including people who are accused of sometimes bad things.
You rallied and raised money for
Let me just
convicted.
finish. Let me finish.
Murders of police.
Let's just
They were
finish.
convicted already.
Let's just finish. Let me
rallied
finish.
and raised money for them.
Tom, am I going to get to finish?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Ellison?
And let me add that I absolutely believe that violent criminals need to be held accountable. But I did say we have to be smart on crime. Just throwing people in a cell does not necessarily make our society safer. What we should do is we should make sure that we use the right penalties and that we use them on people who need to have those penalties exacted upon them. I've been very clear throughout my life that I believe in the rule of law, I believe in safety, and I strongly believe in the presumption of innocence. We can have a criminal justice system and we can have due process of law. That's essentially where I stand on these issues.
Do you, though, regret, even if it was a tangential relationship with Louis Farrakhan or Sarah Jane Olson, do you regret
let me answer that, Tom.
in any way?
Let me just say this, Tom. You know, over 1 million people went to the Million Man March. I was one of them. We did that because we thought that our society needed to.
You worked for Louis Farrakhan.
That is absolutely not true at all. And I believe that the Million Man March was a great event. Louis Farrakhan called that event, by the way. And, you know, there was a time when I thought he had some things to say. That was over 23 years ago that it became clear to me that his value system and mine were not compatible. I have said this.
You met with him in 2016
I
and
did not.
2013.
I absolutely did not. And I can tell you this, that I've made this very clear. Tom, you've been reporting in this town for a long time. You know that I have made it very clear for the past over 20 years that those values expressed by that individual are not my values. And so this is a political thing that my opponents bring up whenever they feel like trying to throw some mud around. But I've been very clear. I am about human rights, liberty, and justice for all people, no matter who they are.
Mr. Wardlow?
Well, the Washington Post, again, gave Keith Ellison 4 Pinocchios for his attempts to disassociate himself from Louis Farrakhan. And the Washington Post is not some conservative bastion. The Washington Post is a mainstream news organization. 4 Pinocchios.
Let me explain that. So the Washington Post was trying to push this 2016 lie.
Well, there's a 2013 meeting when President Rouhani
absolutely
Iran
not.
was in New York.
Can I finish?
Yes, let him finish.
Can I finish?
Let him finish his response.
And I said, look, I was at no such meeting as that. I'm not going to dignify any kind of response to this claim that I was at some 2016 or 15 meeting. They went ahead and wrote it anyway because I didn't want to respond to what I thought was a baseless claim that should not be dignified with even a response. So that's what they wrote in response to me just saying, look, guys, that's nothing, that's nowhere, I'm not going to deal with it. Now, was I in a meeting with Rouhani where Farrakhan was in that same meeting along with about 60 other people? But let me tell you why I was there.
I wouldn't go to a meeting
Let me tell you why I was there. Because Amir Hakmati was in detention in Iran. I went to that meeting to talk to the leader of that country to gain the freedom of an American who was detained behind those walls. That's why I was at that meeting. I make no apologies for being at that meeting. I would do it again to help get an American free.
We're going to move on to another topic. Leah?
Gentlemen, several Minnesota cities have passed sick and safe time ordinances over the last couple of years. There are also more laws supporting workers who are concerned about wage theft and intimidation. Mr. Wardlow, will you support workers while balancing the needs of business owners?
Well, absolutely. We need to protect workers, and I have a history of my career of protecting workers. You know, I fought for workers for 2 years when I fought unfairly dumped and subsidized imports of Chinese steel coming to the United States. And by doing that, we saved hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of jobs in the American steel industry and on the Iron Range right here in Minnesota. The best way to support workers is to support a strong and vibrant economy for Minnesota. But Keith Ellison, he doesn't do that. He has opposed mining. He has strongly opposed pipelines. He sides with radical environmentalists who would shut down mining in Minnesota if they had the chance. Keith Ellison would be bad for our economy, and that undermines workers, and that also means wages would go down. The fact of the matter is, we need to stand with Minnesota workers and for a strong and vibrant economy. And as Attorney General, I would make sure that state agencies don't step out of their legal bounds and overburden job creators. And also, I would protect workers by enforcing wage laws.
Mr. Ellison.
You know, I got a long list of union support. I mean, you could start with the AFL-CIO, the nurses, the teachers. You can go move on there from Teamsters, United Food and Commercial Workers. You can go on and on, AFSCME, SEIU. Why do these worker organizations support me? Because they know I support workers. I support workers because I believe that work has to be rewarded properly. I believe workers have a right to a voice on the job. Now, Mr. Wardlow is the author of the Right to Work for Less legislation in the House. People tell me about how that went down. Even his own party had to try to pull him off of it because they knew at the time it was a bad policy. And he, you know, he's the author of the Right to Work for Less bill in the state of Minnesota. So it's very clear. I believe in standing up for the right for prevailing wage laws, fighting wage theft, standing up for misclassification of workers. And I believe that we have to lift wages, and that means fairness for workers.
Do you think Minnesota should be a right-to-work state where people don't need to join unions or have the right not to?
No, I pushed that when I was in the legislature, but the fact of the matter is I have come to a slightly different view on that. And but it doesn't really matter because the Attorney General's office is not a policy-making job. I'm not going to push right to work or any policy agenda as Attorney General with respect to things that have nothing to do with the office of the Attorney General. Keith Ellison, on the other hand, he wants to push a policy agenda. He wants to sue the president. He said he wants to do that. He wants to sue the president over and over on a variety of different issues. And regardless what anyone thinks about President Trump, that would be an abuse of the powers of the office. The Attorney General is supposed to enforce the law, not make law. He wants to bypass the people's representatives and use the courts to achieve what he can't apparently achieve in Congress.
You know, if I may just respond, look, my office did a study. And in that study, we looked at all of in the Dodd-Frank Act, we required that there be a ratio of CEO pay to worker pay that would be published in corporate documents. We found that in 1968, the average CEO made about 20 times the average worker. Today, it's 339 times. We have to do something to help Minnesota workers get fair and decent pay. I will stand up for that. And I I don't know what he's going to do.
Final word.
We do have a need to make sure that Minnesotans get fair and decent pay. And I think that the way to do that is by supporting a strong and vibrant economy in Minnesota, by making sure that state agencies don't overregulate, go beyond their statutory authority. Everywhere I go in Minnesota, I'm hearing this, from whether I'm talking to people in the mining industry or daycare providers. State agencies are largely out of control, and they are creating problems for job creators. Keith Ellison would side with people that want to overregulate. He wouldn't rein in state agencies. He wouldn't make sure they're doing what's legal. He wouldn't counsel them to back off when they're doing things that are unconstitutional, because he sides with people that want to shut down pipelines and mining.
Let's go back. Can
I just respond to that quickly?
We're out of time on that
Okay,
topic.
so, all right.
Let's go back to the opioids issue. I'm going to give you just 1 minute each on this. We're running short on time. We've got one other topic we want to get to after this. Mr. Ellison, some people think the pharmaceutical industry was in many ways responsible for the opioid crisis, manipulating the market. Is that something where you would seek any kind of legal action against the pharmaceutical industry to address the opioid crisis? You have 1 minute.
Yes, I would. And I'm glad that Lori Swanson has joined the lawsuit. She's suing Purdue Pharmaceuticals right now because of deceptive and tricky marketing practices that gave a illusory and incorrect idea about the addictive power of these drugs. But I think that suing these manufacturers is an important part of what we need to do. They should compensate victims for the trouble that they have caused. I think about 88 people a day die from opioid addiction. Now it's being laced with fentanyl, which is even more dangerous. I think we need a comprehensive approach. We need drug courts. We need to be able to use we need to get medical expertise in on this problem. But I think that, to answer your question directly, that's a key part of what we need to do.
Mr. Wardlow, 1 minute.
We do need to hold Big Pharma accountable for their role in the opioid crisis, absolutely, and I'm not afraid to do that. This is a terrible crisis with a terrible human cost. The fact of the matter is we need to go after companies that are breaking the law, but we also need to go after opioid dealers and opioid pushers on the black market as well. That means strengthening the criminal law division and making sure that our attorneys, county attorneys, prosecutors, and law enforcement have the resources that they need to do that. We also need to enforce our borders and cooperate with federal authorities to do that, because we cannot solve the opioid crisis if we take Mr. Ellison's approach and simply make Minnesota a sanctuary state. That will just open the door for all sorts of terrible drugs to come into the state and destroy more families and destroy more lives.
Leah?
All right, gentlemen, thank you. We can see you clearly disagree on a lot of topics. So I want to wrap up with this. Would you identify a positive quality of your opponent, Mr. Wardlow?
I think that Mr. Ellison has very passionate beliefs, and he does believe the things he says, and that's a good thing.
Mr. Ellison?
I think Mr. Wardlow dresses well. I like that tie. That's a pretty good tie. You know what? You know why I said this about Mr. Wardlow? His father's a really nice man. I'll say that about Lynn Wardlow.
He is a very nice man and a fantastic role model.
Well, look at that. Gentlemen, thank you. Before we end this debate, we want to move on to the closing statements. Each of you have 1 minute to tell us what you learned about your opponent tonight and why Minnesotans should vote for you. Mr. Ellison, you're first, please.
You know, the core basis of Mr. Wardlaw's campaign is that he's going to be apolitical, he doesn't have any opinion, he's just going to enforce the laws written. And yet we see him saying he's going to fire 42 people based on their party affiliation. Then he doesn't stop there. He goes on to pledge to use the office to support and defend President Trump's agenda. He doesn't stop there. He says he's going to change the complexion of the state of Minnesota to elect more Republicans. That's about as partisan as you can get. My view is that we need a Minnesota Attorney General who is focused on two things. One, making sure that Minnesotans can afford their lives, that they can afford their insulin, that they can afford their diabetes medication, their heart medication, and that their cancer, and that they have an advocate on their side who will stand up and defend them. Also, we need someone who's going to stand up for people's human rights. And I don't care if you're straight, gay, black, white, or whatever color you are. If I'm the Attorney General, you will be able to walk into any establishment in the state of Minnesota and get the human rights that everybody should enjoy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Ellison, thank you very much. Doug Wardlow, you have 1 minute.
Absolutely. So as Attorney General, I will fight for, protect, and defend all Minnesotans. I will fight for the legal rights of every single Minnesotan, regardless of sex, sexual orientation, gender, or creed. And that is what we need the Attorney General to do, and that is what I will do. Keith Ellison, we have learned this evening that Keith Ellison, we've learned what we already knew, that Keith Ellison is an extreme wash politician who wants to use the Attorney General's office to push a radical policy agenda. He stands for sanctuary cities. He has been associated with Louis Farrakhan for quite a long time. Mr. Ellison also wants to bypass the citizens' legislatures and go through the courts to push his policies, and that's just unacceptable. He's a regular cheerleader for cop killers, and you can look these things up. He stands with cop killers. He stands with criminals. He opposed a bill to prevent teachers from being sexual predators, to prevent sexual predators from working as teachers in our schools. You can't make this stuff up. It's just disturbing. But when I'm Attorney General, I'm going to offer something different. I'm going to protect and defend all Minnesotans, and I'm going to enforce the law and make sure that Minnesota is fair and safe. Thank you.
All right, Doug Wardlow and Keith Ellison, thank you both for taking time to participate with us tonight. Stay right where you are for the moment. Leah, you wanted to thank our sponsors for tonight.
I do want to thank our sponsors. We could not have put on this event tonight without help from Metro State, which was so helpful tonight. Our sponsors as well, the St. Paul Area Chamber of Commerce, Prosperity's Front Door, and the Citizens League. Thank you for teaming up with us to help us bring these debates tonight. I hope we got a chance to help Minnesotans make an informed decision as we head into Election Day coming right up.
Number of Chamber of Commerce sponsors as well. Twin West, if we have that graphic again, Twin West, I believe Dakota, Minnesota Chamber, the Dakota County Chamber of Minneapolis. We want to thank all of them as well for putting this on. This has been quite an undertaking to make this available statewide, something very rare, commercial-free, statewide, primetime on a Sunday night. And most of all, we want to thank the two candidates before us now and all of the candidates who've chosen to be here tonight.
And we did have a busy day of debates today. If you didn't catch all of our debates, we have them all online. We spoke with the gubernatorial candidates before the attorney generals were here this evening. We spoke with a lot of congressional candidates today and candidates in the race for Senate, too. So all of that is found online at kstp.com, along with all of our political coverage.
And again, we want to thank Metro State for providing this beautiful building with the backdrop of downtown St. Paul. It has been outstanding, and I know the people in the audience here have been very dutifully, very quiet, but now they can applaud our two candidates and all of the candidates who took part in today's debates. Mr. Wardlow, Mr. Ellison, thank you for taking part in this great democratic exercise, and that is it for our debate.
Coming up in about 8 minutes, we take you to New Jersey for a debate in the race to represent that state in the U.S. Senate. First, part of this morning's Washington Journal.
This was revealed by a letter that was sent out by the O'Connor family, the Washington Post writing it up, saying that the letter released by Justice O'Connor, who was 88 years old, said she wanted to be, quote, open about these changes, and while I am still able to share some personal thoughts. And some of the letter yesterday, some of it read as such, saying that when it comes to her condition, saying, while the final chapter of my life with dementia might be trying, nothing has diminished my gratitude with deep appreciation and the countless blessings of my life. As a young cowgirl from the Arizona desert, I never could have imagined that one day I would become the first woman justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. I hope I have inspired young people about civic engagement and helped pave the pathway for women who may have been faced obstacles pursuing their careers. That's from the letter that was sent out by the family yesterday. On the phone joining us to tell us more, Greg Storr of Bloomberg News. He covers the Supreme Court. Greg Storr, good morning.
Good morning, Pedro.
Good morning. Could you tell us a little bit more about the revelation yesterday and the impact that it's had on the current members of the Supreme Court?
Yeah, it came a day after the Associated Press wrote a story in which her son said that she would be stepping away from public life, and he said that she had been having both some short-term memory issues and some physical issues with her hip. The news about the dementia was the real revelation in this letter, and that clearly hit some of her former colleagues and the current justices very hard. All the current members of the court and the retired justices as well put out rather personal and very warm and very admiring statements. The one that struck me the most was Justice Stephen Breyer's, who was always very close to Justice O'Connor, and he spoke to her directly about how much she had meant to him. She is clearly somebody who is very much missed among her former colleagues on the court.
Your story this morning mentions that because of her condition and her being a justice on the Supreme Court, it allowed her to have some type of an office space or at least some type of chamber there at the court. Can you tell our viewers a little more about that and what happens now?
Yeah, the retired justices are allowed to keep the chambers there. They often have a law clerk who helps them out and sometimes also works for the other justices. She has given up that chamber now to retired Justice Kennedy. That was kind of an early indication that she might be stepping back from her public role.
And when it comes to her time on the court, what are the highlights for the justice?
Well, she is a justice that we may not have going forward. She was a justice who was very much in the middle of the court, who decided cases often on a very fact-specific nature. And so she would decide, for example, whether a holiday display violated the Constitution based on rather specific facts about whether it was just a nativity scene or whether it was surrounded by secular or indications of the season or symbols from other religions. The biggest vote she cast and biggest series of votes she cast came in the abortion context. When she joined the court, conservatives had hoped she would be someone who would vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, but she was part of the group that in 1992 rather strongly reaffirmed abortion rights. She never became the kind of hardcore conservatives that some of her backers had hoped. Instead, she was a justice whose vote quite often was up for grabs when folks went in for arguments.
There's a little bit of a backstory with her in the sense that she was caring for her husband who had dealt with similar type of issues. Can you talk a little bit about that and the impact that it had on their marriage?
Yeah, she when she stepped down she announced her retirement in 2005. It was in part to try to care for her husband John, who had Alzheimer's, and he died a few years later. And as it turned out, he was actually, by the time she actually left the court in 2006, he was too far gone with the disease for her to do a whole lot. One rather touching aspect of it, both touching and heartbreaking, was that what happens apparently with Alzheimer's patients is that when they start losing, when they lose the ability to recognize people who matter to them, they might build up new relationships with people they don't know. And so John O'Connor, in the home where he was staying, actually built up a romance with another woman there. And according to the O'Connor's son, the justice was actually thrilled for him because it meant that he had, in this time when he couldn't remember her, Justice O'Connor, he had somebody with him that made him happy.
That says Greg Stohr of Bloomberg News. He covers the Supreme Court and talking about the retired Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, diagnosed with dementia. You talked a lot about, particularly what stood out about her personally to you, John. I'm sorry, Greg.
Well, she had this incredibly matter-of-fact personality. It's shown in a lot of areas. It's shown when you talk to people who knew her well, and it's shown very much on the court. She didn't beat around the bush on the court. She was often the first one to ask a question. It was often a very pointed question. She was a very strong woman who starting with her background growing up on the ranch in Arizona, and she didn't like to have her time wasted, and she was very much somebody who was exactly who she presented herself to be.
Greg Stohr joining us on the phone about Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. Mr. Stohr, thanks for your time again.
My pleasure.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Thursday morning, Democratic strategist Steve McMahon and Republican strategist Todd Harris talk about the best and worst political ads of the 2018 elections. And Boston College Law School professor Ray Madoff joins us to discuss estate and inheritance tax laws. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live at 7 Eastern Thursday morning. Join the discussion.